So I'm going to do a video on the Old Testament, and first I'm going to start off reading a little bit of New Testament because it's all tied together. And so let me get started reading what we've got on the screen here. This is obviously from First Peter, and just briefly look at the description. For other things, there's all the links except these two that I'm going to read from the New Testament are in the description. So in this First Peter, what I wanted to read is some encouragement, first of all, and that this is something that's really, lately a lot of people, especially Christians, just feel so weighed down with everything, and they are sometimes not sure of their salvation and all that. So I just, at the last moment when I was preparing this hangout, decided to bring these up. And we've gone over these before, but sometimes it's a matter of timing. And Peter says, blessings to the God and Father of Master Jesus the Anointed, who regenerated us according to his vast mercy into a living hope. This comes through the resurrection of Jesus the Anointed from the dead, into an inheritance that is incorruptible, untainted, unfading, having been kept in the heavens for you all. You are those being garrisoned in the power of God through faith into a salvation ready to be revealed in the last age. So this is a hope of and a guarantee as both. Something you don't have yet is still something you hope for, and yet it is still guaranteed. So, and technically some people wouldn't call that a hope, but the Bible does, and it says that it will be revealed in the last age, not yet, but it is uncorruptible and untainted and unfading and kept in heaven and guarded there. And he goes on to say, briefly, at the present time you're being exalted and sorrowed by various trials if necessary, so that your faith will be tested and proved, much more valuable than gold. So just a little encouraging verse there to hang in there. And then the other one, this also references, is tie into the Old Testament, that Paul said when he wrote to the Ephesians. He says, this is chapter 3, this is why I, Paul, am a prisoner of anointed Jesus for the sake of the non-Judeans, that is to say the Gentiles. Surely you have heard of the detailed plan of God's favor to me for your sakes. He revealed the secret to me, as I wrote to you briefly before. So, and then skipping down to verse 5, it was not revealed to people in other generations, but is now revealed in spirit to his holy ambassadors and prophets. This secret is that the non-Judeans would be joint heirs of the same body, sharing in the promise of anointed Jesus through the gospel. So this is something that you won't find point blank in the Old Testament. This is something we have to understand. And let me go on now to what a testament or covenant is. This is, as I said, all these links are in the description, hopefully in the same order. And covenants, the Hebrew term for covenant is berit, or however you pronounce that, meaning to bond or fetter. That is to say, fetter. That is to say, locking you into something you are held to. That's what the word meant. And we have two different Greek words that you can see there. This is the first things I read for the question in the chat were from the New Testament. Okay, and now we're getting into the Old and defining some terms first of all. Anyway, we see that the word covenant, which applies also to both testaments, covenant and testament are interchangeable, but both involve obligations, promises, rituals, possibly. And though it has come to mean, covenant has come to mean a little more narrow meaning in the church age, which people have tended to use for a particular kind of contract or testament between God and people, especially the Jews. And in the Bible especially, the idea of a covenant or testament is usually seen as a relation between God and humanity, but in the Bible there are examples of purely secular covenants between leaders like Abraham and Abimelech, or between a king and his people. So even so, the secular covenants were seen as before God. So that's why they could be called covenants. But that's just a trifling detail. It's no big deal whether you use covenant or testament. And testament being from the Latin testamentum, and So that's where that word caught on, is from the Latin translation. And as I've said before, it wasn't the best translation. It wasn't the most accurate. And the King James sometimes relied upon it. And so that's where some errors crept in. Anyway, it goes over in this article some of the key covenants in the Bible. First was the Abraham. Well, actually, before that, we had Adam and Eve. Of course, there was certain things that were not called covenants, but by description they kind of are. But this starts with the one with Abraham in Genesis 15, where God promises Abraham land, innumerable descendants, and an ongoing special relationship between those descendants and God. Nothing is asked for in return. Neither Abraham nor his descendants owe God anything in exchange for the land or the relationship. Circumcision is expected as a sign of this covenant, but not as a payment. So that's an important thing to understand, is that a sign is not a payment. This was a unilateral contract by God to Abraham and his descendants. And the sign of circumcision, as I think I've mentioned, and possibly in one of, I know in my Hangouts before and some others, that there's a tie-in between the fact that Eve would be Adam's help, that the seed of the woman, the seed of Eve, eventually through Mary, would be the help that Adam needed, and that this sign of circumcision was in the older days called removing the fig leaf, which would apply to Adam as being responsible for the sin, since he did it in rebellion, open rebellion, with his eyes wide open, and didn't have to be fooled as Eve was. So there is a tie-in in all this, and this covenant had this sign with it of circumcision, because through this plan, this unilateral covenant, God would eventually save the world through the people of Abraham, because this was a promise and not the law. And these were two different things. Then later, 430 years later, we have the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai with the Hebrews. Sinai. I've heard it pronounced wrong most of my life, and so I sometimes say it that way, but no big deal. A certain mountain with that name in the Middle East. Anyway, some covenants which God is depicted as having enacted with humans are everlasting, in the sense that there is no human side of the bargain, because God is everlasting. So there's no human side of the bargain that people must uphold lest the covenant end. In other words, most covenants between two or more parties have to be upheld by all, or the whole thing is off if one of them drops it. In this case, only God is involved, and so he, being eternal, cannot drop the covenant unless the conditions are met. And that's another way to end a covenant, is meeting the conditions. So the particular Mosaic covenant, the covenant with Moses, especially as a representative of Israel, was done on Mount Sinai, as described in Deuteronomy, is a heavily conditioned one, different from the one made to Abraham. Okay, so this is the contrast between the one to Abraham, the promise, and the one to Moses, the law. These are two very different covenants or testaments or contracts. The Mosaic covenant with the Hebrews at Sinai is described in Deuteronomy as a heavily conditioned one, because the continuation of this covenant is dependent upon the Hebrews faithfully obeying God and doing their duties. So there's two senses in which Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets. One is by directly living under the law and the prophets, as he did, and did it perfectly, as no other human has ever done. And this is true today. There are people who want to keep the law who cannot keep it and don't care that they cannot keep it, but somehow they think they're obeying the law. Go figure. But the other condition is that the Hebrews broke it when they rejected their Messiah. The contract was off at that point because they rejected him. Once he was put on the cross, that was it. The contract was over. And that could be also another reason that the temple curtain was torn. So we have these two senses in which this covenant was ended, one by fulfillment and the other by failure to fulfill on the part of the Jews. And here again, remember, there are different covenants, and one is not dependent on people. That would be the one to Abraham. And the other was totally dependent on people, and that was the one to Moses. Then there was another covenant with David, and God is getting more specific as you go through the Old Testament. He's getting more specific with his covenants and more narrow in scope. The Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7 is one where God promises a permanent dynasty of kings on the throne of Israel from David's lineage. As with the Abrahamic covenant, nothing is asked for in return. Unfaithful kings may be punished and criticized, but the Davidic line would not be ended because of this. The Davidic covenant was popular as it promised continuing political stability, secure worship at the temple, and a peaceful life for all the people. So this one is kind of a in between. It's unconditional because God made it to David and never failed to keep this promise, but it didn't mean that every descendant of David as a king was in the will of God, but the covenant itself could not be broken, but those kings could be rejected. And that's what we see throughout the Old Testament, all these stories about the kings of Israel. They did have many purposes, and us learning about these things, and that they were written down for our instruction, as the New Testament says, but also that this covenant being unilateral was more like the Abraham one than the Moses one, and so it could not be broken, but individual violators could be discarded and excluded from the contract because they did not meet the terms in the first place. The contract could not be broken by them, but they could be excluded from it. Then we have the universal covenant with Noah, which predates all of these. They're not going in chronological order here necessarily. They were from Abraham to Moses to David, but now they're going back to Genesis here, to the time of Noah, not absolutely the beginning of Genesis, but the time of Noah. And there was a universal covenant at the end of the flood. Noah is the primary witness to it, but the promise to not again destroy life on such a scale is made to all humans and all other life on the planet. They said planet, of course, and don't worry about that. But the promise was that God would never again flood the earth. And this promise is held throughout the Bible, but there is a promise of destruction again, but this time it will be by fire. So understand the terms of this contract, another being unilateral, that God made the promise to himself that he would not do this, with Noah as a witness. Then we have, jumping back again to the time of Moses, in that general contract or covenant or testament, we have a particular one with the 10 Commandments. And of course, that wasn't the whole of the law. It was the 10 that God wrote down himself. The rest he dictated to Moses. So as they say here, has been suggested by some scholars, that the 10 Commandments is best understood by comparing it to some of the treaties written during the same time period. Rather than a list of laws, the commandments are, in this view, actually an agreement between God and his chosen people, the Hebrews. The relationship between the Jews and God is thus at least as much legal as it is personal. So this is just kind of a different perspective on the 10 Commandments and why God wrote those down and not all of them, and why there were more besides this. And this suggestion here is that this was sort of a contract within a contract, I guess you could call it, and not just a moral law, some people call it. Then we have the new covenant of the Christians, and Jesus himself said this, that this is the new covenant in my blood. That is to say, he was signing the contract in his blood, and this was the death of the testator in legal terms, the death of the one that made a will and testament, that this will and testament is not to be unsealed until the person who made it has died. And that's what Jesus was signifying that was going to happen at the Last Supper, and that death would institute a new covenant. This is where we get those terms, Old and New Testament, because even Hebrews, and this is not something anybody made up, it's in Hebrews in the New Testament, that by calling this one new, he calls the other one old. This is right out of the Bible. And if it's old, it's passing away, as the Hebrews said. Hebrews was written in a time when the temple was still standing, and it was about to go away, and they knew it, and that happened by AD 90 or AD 70, and then by AD 95 we had the end of the New Testament canon. Anyway, there's this New Testament with Jesus, with Christ, and it says the dominant conception of covenant tended to rely mostly on the Abrahamic and Davidic models, where humans didn't have to do anything in order to deserve or retain God's grace. So this is more like those kind of covenants. They didn't have anything to uphold. They just had to accept what God was offering. And this is the same with the covenant as we know it as Christianity, as the gospel. The gospel is a covenant of acceptance, just as some of the others they mentioned here are. And there's nothing you can do to get it. There's nothing you can do to lose it once you get it. So it is a unilateral contract offered by God, and whoever wants to be part of it can be so by choice. That's the gospel message. Then we have the old contrasted with the new here. In Christianity, the concept of a testament came to be used to designate the old covenant with the Jews, the Old Testament, and the new covenant with all of humanity through the sacrificial death of Jesus, the New Testament. The Jews naturally object to their scriptures being referred to as the Old Testament because for them, their covenant with God is current and relevant, not a historical relic as implied by Christian terminology. So they do take offense at these terms. But these are terms that Jesus himself and his apostles gave us, and they called it that. And this, of course, they reject Jesus in the whole New Testament, so that's to be understood. But as to know this, as to not cause too much offense needlessly, if you're trying to reach a Jew with the gospel, it would be helpful not to trigger them with certain terms, just to keep that in mind. And then what is covenant theology? I've mentioned this before, and it's usually in the perspective or context of the discussion of Calvinism. And what they mean by it is kind of described here as they're saying developed by Puritans. You'll see Calvinists refer to the Puritans all the time, that this is their people that they like to look to. And covenant theology to them is an attempt to reconcile two apparently exclusive doctrines. The doctrine that only elect can or will be saved, and the doctrine that God is perfectly just. And I won't go into all of that right now, the whole Calvinism, Arminianism debate. But they call this the covenant of grace, and they don't accept what I've been calling dispensationalism. This is a common term I didn't make up, but that God has different contracts and relationships with people through the ages or dispensations, and that the covenant theology of the Puritans and Calvinists does not recognize this, and instead they believe there is only one covenant. They go on here to say, according to the Puritans, God's covenant of grace for us means that while we are not able to have faith in God on our own, God can give us the ability, which to me is still operating us like puppets. There's no logical way out of this conclusion. And then, the love of a robot or puppet is not genuine and not worthy of God, in my opinion, and the opinion of most Arminians or anyone who isn't that's what Calvinists will call anyone who isn't a Calvinist an Arminian, whether they follow the teachings are Arminius or not, just as the Jews divide the world into Jews and Gentiles. So it's kind of one of those us and not us names. So this is just a brief explanation of what some people mean by covenant theology. And I'm going to drop that page because there's another link just to get a couple of different witnesses on some of these things. And it's, again, a binding agreement or compact between two or more parties. And whether or not it depends on both parties is a different issue. Like we said, there are unilateral contracts, but they're contracts nonetheless. So, in legal terms, they say here is a formal sealed agreement or contract. And then they go into some of the similar things we've been over in the other one, and about the inequality of the parties between the creator and creatures. And then they go also into the Hebrew words. And it also, the Hebrew word has a meaning to cut, which is to divide, and has reference to the practice in those days of dividing an animal into two parts and the parties walking between the cut animal as a way to bind them together on an oath of death or a blood oath, so to speak. But this was just an enactment of the severity or seriousness of the contract. This was like putting your signature on something. And so they go into why they think this practice was developed. And that they also have said what I mentioned earlier about testament and covenant being pretty much interchangeable. And that's where we get these names, Old and New Testaments. So it says in here, the amazing things about such examples of divine covenant is that they are the gracious means of relationship with God for a people who deserve to be removed from his presence forever. In other words, God doesn't just make contracts with people who deserve it. This is certainly not the case. And I've gone over before how undeserving anyone is of mercy, because by nature, mercy is giving help or aid or forgiveness to someone who is totally guilty, but they are sorry about what they did, and so God is granting mercy, or anyone who has, been wronged, they have only that person has the ability to grant mercy. But at the same time, there is this issue of the Jews in particular as a chosen people that I've said before, were not chosen for their excellent qualities, and quite the opposite. They were a very wayward people in many respects, which again is a testament to the fact that the Jews did not make up the Bible. They may have written it down, but they did not invent it because it portrays them in a bad light. So they, being the wayward people they were, and many of their kings were quite evil, the covenant with God could not be broken, and because it depended on him and not them. And so I've gone over that before about the chosen people, but so they give what they call three crucial aspects of divine covenant, which they call unilateral establishment. Unilateral meanings by across one, not across two or more, relational bond, and ultimate commitment. So each of these aspects is brought out in some book that they mention here about blood oaths. But anyway, just to establish what exactly a covenant or a testament is kind of important when the topic of discussion is testaments, Old Testament especially, because I've gone all over the New. Well, why is it new is the question that comes up. And so we're finding that out. Then to just a quick brief overview of this Bible history website has a quick handy overview of what the Old Testament is about. And it says the Bible covers the period from the creation of man, which took place approximately 4000 BC by most people's estimates, all the way to the coming of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, and the good news or gospel, which spread rapidly in the 1st century AD with the preaching of Paul, the apostle, and the establishment of churches throughout the Roman Empire. The New Testament ends around the same time the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, the New Testament didn't end in 70 AD. This may be a preterist site. I'm not sure. I didn't look around. But that 70 AD is agreed upon by everybody that that's when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and the Jews were sent into exile and scattered all over the earth as prophesied. But the temple, or the New Testament itself, was not finished until 95 AD when the Apostle John was exiled on the Isle of Patmos by Domitian, the Roman emperor. And that's when he, the Isle of Patmos, as I've mentioned before, is off the coast of Turkey, and he could see those 7 churches that the revelation was sent to. And so that canon of the New Testament was not closed until 95 AD, but Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And this quick summary, they go on to say here, will cover the main events that took place during the periods of the Old and New Testaments. And so the main historical periods that they give here, the creation and the fall, these periods, these main historical periods, can also be roughly equated to dispensations. Again, this is why I believe in dispensationalism as a proper approach to the Bible, because God changes his dealings with mankind according to different epochs, eras, or ages in the Bible. And these are easily discerned. You just read the Bible and you see this. And one is, as mentioned, the creation to the fall. And so God created everything in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and then Adam and Eve eventually, doesn't say how long afterwards, rebelled against God, and God made a covering for them, indicating that it was only through the blood of a substitute that they could approach God. And this doesn't mean that the animals could actually accomplish this, as the Bible itself says later, that the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. This could only be a picture or type or shadow, as the New Testament calls it, of the ultimate real sacrifice, which is what Jesus would be, the Lamb of God. That's why he's called that. So God pronounced in this instance a curse upon, well, he didn't actually curse the man and the woman. He cursed the serpent and the earth. There is no curse. So I disagree, and on standard disclaimer on all these things. But the nice thing is that it's a quick outline, but I don't agree with every detail. And this is one. There is no curse pronounced on man and woman. The only curse was pronounced on the ground that the man would have to work. And the fact that since the woman would choose to follow him out of the garden, and because as the Septuagint puts it more clearly, that the woman would turn back or turn away to her husband, and then he would rule over her. This was the only curse, and it wasn't on her especially. It was just, you're going to do this and such will result. And so obedience and being dominated were never part of God's plan, and Jesus being the last Adam would take that away. But this was the first historical period between the creation and everything was just fine, and when both man and woman eventually rebelled against God. And so that at this time, that is when God pronounced that the Messiah would come someday, and it would come through the woman, not the man. So then we have the flood period. So they're kind of including a lot of things here. I would call that one age from creation to fall, another age from the fall to Noah, the flood. Okay. This is not a contract, but a historical period. And then we have another one from, most people who are into dispensationalism don't say to the Tower of Babel is an age, but I kind of have to think it is. And that's because something changed there, although it wasn't a contractual change, as not all the dispensations are anyway. That the fact is that things changed significantly for the whole world, and so in that respect you could consider it a certain age. But it was certainly a very important historical marker, because at this time, as I've mentioned in another hangout at Flat Out Elected, not the most recent hangout, but the one before that, where there was this event at the Tower of Babel where God confused the languages. Everybody spoke one language until then. And then it was all broken up into pieces, and so people would scatter. They would not work together, and they would divide up into nations and people groups because of language. And of course, if they can't talk to each other, they don't intermarry or do business together. And so this is the origin of ethnic groups. And because of this, this is a shrinking of the gene pool in each case. Each one of them had fewer people to intermarry with, and so the genetic possibilities were lessened for each group. Each one would have different sets of recessive genes that would come to the forefront. And that's where you get your different ethnicities from that event. Because as we've shown in that other hangout, the other channel, all you need for Adam and Eve, or for Noah and his sons and their wives, is having the parents have a certain set of dominant and recessive genes, and you can get every combination of skin color, hair color, eye color, and so forth from that set. And it doesn't take many generations at all. It's really a roll of the dice. And we've seen this in more modern times, where they would have one, a mixed race couple, one very dark black and the other very white, have twins, one who was very dark black and the other white, and not just skin color, not one being albino, because some people have the mistaken idea, the biologically ignorant idea, that whiteness is simply albinism, which it is not. I mean, I have seen albino blacks that you could tell were black people with the hair and the lips and the ears and the nose, and the only thing that wasn't black about them was their skin, because there's more about being African descendant than just skin color, because even in Africa, you have everything from light brown to very deep, dark black. So here again, albinism is not whiteness. Whiteness is not albinism. Albinism, it can even happen to whites, because back in the days, the early days of, like the 70s rock, there was these twins. I'm trying to think of their name. The Edgar Winter and what was his brother's name? Johnny Winter. They were twins. And I think at least one of them, if not both, was albino. And they were white guys, but you rarely saw their eyes because their eyes were red. That's typically what you will see, because in albinism, you don't even have eye color. So you're not an albino just because you have light skin, just to put that to bed. Anyway, the Tower of Babel is where these subsets, these genetic subpools originated. So that's a significant part. And this is something that you'll see in the Old Testament as well. This is all what they call in this article historical period number 1. I would divide it up a little more, and they divided it in a place where I didn't necessarily, which was from the flood to the Tower of Babel, but it's a significant difference. But God did not relate differently. And I think dispensationalism more is concerned with how God relates to people than whether or not there's a significant change on the earth. Anyway, that's something to be noted in the Old Testament. The next period they are talking about in this article is the Abrahamic period. And here again, I've talked about Abrahamic religions being the only possible ones are Judaism and Christianity. Islam is not an Abrahamic religion because there was no Islam until about 620 or something like that AD. And Abraham had two lines of descendants, and only the child of promise, which was Isaac, not Ishmael, can be a physical descendant of Abraham. And so here again, there's just so many reasons, genetic, physically, and spiritually. Abraham is not the ancestor of Islam. He can be the ancestor of Arabs, but not Islam. So, as the article says here, Abraham was the first Hebrew, the first wanderer. That's what, there's discussion about what it means, but he was the first wanderer because he left his homeland without knowing where he was going. Okay, so looking back at this article again, that regardless of what trivia about the word Hebrew, what it means, that he was the first one because of that. He left his homeland and he went to Ur of the Chaldees. So here again, we get into the genetic lines. What race was Abraham? He was Middle Eastern, not African. His skin was probably a medium brown, as you would see in Middle Easterners today, but not African. They are neither white nor black. They are medium brown and do not have the typical African features such as the nose and lips and, the smaller ears, bigger lips and nose, and the hair. They don't have the same hair necessarily. They're kind of in between. And so this is, again, probably more like Adam and Eve would be a Middle Eastern kind of genetics, out of which every kind of variation can come, from very white to very black. Anyway, Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees, and that's where is the Middle East. This is Iraq area. So God promised Abraham that if he would obey him, God would multiply his descendants as the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky, and one of his descendants would be the Savior of all mankind, typically called the descendant. And we've gone over that in other videos on the New Testament that go into detail discussing that. Isaac was Abraham's child that was born in his old age according to the promise of the Lord. That's the child of promise, was Isaac. His name means laughter because Abraham's wife Sarah laughed that she was going to bear a son in her old age. And this is, again, going back to Peter that we started this with from the New Testament, who was talking about Sarah calling Abraham her Lord. This is the time she did it. When she said, "Is my Lord going to, father a child with me in my old age?" She was laughing at that. And so just, a little more trivia, but kind of important when you get to Peter, but we're doing Old Testament, so we're not going to do that today. Anyway, this was the child of promise, not Ishmael, who is the ancestor of the Arabic peoples. This Isaac is the line through which God would bring the Jews, and not the Arabs or the Muslims, especially because Muslim is a religious designation and not a genetic one. So that's what the name means laughter. And then Jacob was the father of 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob actually means deceiver, or literally grabber, but God turned everything about his life into a blessing, and his name was changed to Israel. Okay, so we have this line of grandfather, father, and son, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And even Jacob's brother Esau was rejected, and he is the father, I believe, of the Edomites, which is more Saudi Arabia type of Arabs. And you can follow these lines if you look up something like Table of Nations, and I have some documents on my computer somewhere about that. And so, yes, this Isaac is the child of promise, and then Isaac had Jacob and Esau, but only Jacob was the child of promise in that case. And from Jacob came the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel after a struggle with God. That's what Israel means. He struggles with God. And you can read about that incident in the Old Testament. And Then Joseph, one of those sons, the favorite child, which causes problems in any family. You have a favorite child. This is not the best parenting, but it worked out. God works things out. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob. His beloved wife, Rachel, died giving birth to him. So, and if you read the story, his father had been fooled into marrying the older sister because that was the tradition. And yet he had worked for 7 years for her father to win her in marriage. And yet the father instead snuck in the older sister instead of the younger one he wanted to marry. And so he didn't care much for the older sister. But she bore most of his children, and the younger two were born by Rachel, the one he really wanted all that time. She didn't die in childbirth with Joseph. She died in childbirth with Benjamin, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it was Benjamin. Joseph was the second to last child, and Benjamin was the youngest. And it was Benjamin who was the one was being born, and Rachel died while giving birth to him. So they're mistaken in this article, I'm pretty sure. I should go look that up because I do that sort of thing. Let's go to Bible Gateway. I'm almost positive, but I want to be thorough here. Let's see. Let's look up Benjamin. And let's see. Yeah, as she breathed her last, she was dying. She named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin, son of my right arm, instead of son of my sorrow, I think it was. That's what the names meant. So there it is in Genesis 35:18. She died in childbirth with Benjamin, not as this one says with Joseph. Joseph was the second to last child. But Joseph and Benjamin were the only children of Rachel. Okay, so they're mistaken about that. But Joseph could interpret dreams, and he had many spiritual dreams, and his brothers hated him because of that. And this again ties into that so-called the sign of the woman with the 12 stars and the sun and the moon that was all the rage in September, because this is where that imagery comes from. And the reason it's given in Revelation, in my opinion, is to identify it as representative of Israel. Because this is what Joseph's dream was about. One of the dreams, he had many dreams, but one was that the sun, moon, and stars would bow to him. And they understood it immediately as, his father said, "Do you mean to tell me that your mother and I and your brothers will all bow to you?" And they all took offense at him. And this was, indicative of the future. God was telling him a future dreams, but he used the jealousy of his brothers to actually save his people, because there was coming a famine in Israel, and because Joseph was sent there by, being sold into slavery by his jealous brothers who hated him. So most of them wanted to kill him, but the older brother, the oldest, I think it was Judah, one of those guys said, "No, don't do that. We can't," and he was going to, he went off somewhere, and the brothers threw Joseph into a well to decide what to do with him. And the older one came back and tore his robes and said, "What have you done? He's gone. I can't find him." And they said, "Look, we threw him in this well. Hey, here comes a band of nomads that are going to Egypt. Let's sell him to them, and we'll be done with him, and then we'll tell your father he was killed." And that's how Joseph wound up in Egypt, and why the prophecy would eventually be fulfilled that out of Egypt I called my son. That's one of the fulfillments. The other was that Jesus, of course, when he was a baby, was taken to Egypt for safety when Herod went berserk trying to he killed all the children under 2 years old when he found out the Magi went off in a different direction. I've been over that before, but then that's why Jesus was in Egypt for a time, and he was called out of that to come back to Israel. But anyway, the thing about Joseph was that the dream indicated who Israel is in Revelation, that woman represented Israel giving birth to the Messiah and then the church, because the head and then the body comes out. And when the woman's giving birth. And then in this original incident, Joseph's dream made his brothers jealous. They sold him to slavery. He wound up in Egypt and eventually became second in command to Pharaoh himself, and was thus able to take in his family during the famine, and they could prosper there. And that's how they multiplied in the land of Goshen in Egypt. And then eventually, of course, as the Bible says, a Pharaoh came along who did not remember or care about Joseph, and what he had done for Egypt, and he enslaved the Jews. So that's what all that's about. But this is an error saying that Rachel died while giving birth to Joseph. It was Benjamin, his younger brother. So then the older brothers were jealous of him and sold him into slavery in Egypt, and that God was with him, and his life in Joseph was able to save the Hebrews from extinction. That's what that's all about. Then their next historical period was that that they call Moses and the Exodus, which, like I said, this is not straight up dispensationalism. We only recognize 7 dispensations that have to do with God, how God deals with the whole world pretty much. And this is a different set of divisions. So don't take this as a dispensationalist thing, but it kind of overlaps a little bit. So Moses and the Exodus, Moses is called when the Hebrews were in Egypt. Okay, so they had been slaves there. And during that time, it says, as you see in this paragraph here, Pharaoh had ordered the death of all Hebrew male children because they were growing up. They were growing so rapidly. That is to say, not the children were growing rapidly, but the nation was growing. The Hebrew women were just turning out babies, apparently, and the Egyptians were becoming concerned because they considered them a threat to their security, being a different people group than the Egyptians were. Here again, people confuse and say, no, the Israelites were the Egyptians. No, the Egyptians enslaved them because they were not. So you can point to this when anybody brings up that argument. Anyway, when Moses was born, he grew up in the house of Pharaoh because, and they kind of left that part out of here, what happened was that they tried to hide Moses because Pharaoh had ordered all the babies to be killed. The midwives who went to assist with the births, and there were 2 of them in Israel, they were supposed to, if the baby born was a boy, to kill it. Well, they were refusing to do so. They stood up to Pharaoh and said, they made up a story, basically, and said, the Hebrew women are vigorous and strong and not slow like the Egyptian women, and so they give birth before we even get there. So, sorry, too bad, we can't kill the boys. So that was what the Hebrew midwives did, and they were midwives because they were childless themselves, and it says, as an incidental remark in the Old Testament, that God granted, because of the boldness of these midwives and their fearlessness before Pharaoh of all people, that he gave them families of their own. So God does notice these things, and there's not always an immediate response, but he does notice these things, we can guarantee. Anyway, in the case of Moses, the parents decided that they just couldn't allow his birth to be known, so they hid him as long as they possibly could until he was weaned, or not completely weaned, but as long as they were able to, and then they put him in that famous little ark. And I've gone over ark before at the other hangout, like 2 hangouts ago at Flat Out Elected, about the ark, and they have some articles there about the different meanings of the Hebrew words and so forth. But it was an ark that he was put into, not the Ark of the Covenant and not Noah's Ark, but an ark all the same Hebrew word. And it was a reed basket coated with pitch so it wouldn't leak. And Moses was placed inside of it and set in the Nile River because the parents were just leaving him to God's hands because they couldn't hide him anymore. Well, a daughter of Pharaoh, found the basket and opened it and said, "Can we keep him?" And then they let him keep him. And so she raised Pharaoh in the household. She raised Moses in the household of Pharaoh, and that's how he wound up there. Okay, so they kind of just, that's all I got out of this statement. Moses was born and grew up in the house of Pharaoh. That's kind of really skipped a lot, so I thought I'd better fill that in. Then later, at some point, he developed a yearning to seek after the Hebrew God. Well, he was a Hebrew, and everybody knew it. And then they're skipping a lot again here. Of course, that's not their purpose in this article, but just to fill you guys in, if you didn't know, that he one day was, he was upset at the enslavement of his people, naturally, and he saw an Egyptian overlord or foreman badly mistreating an Israelite, so he intervened and killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand, and he thought nobody saw him. And yet later, people found out about it, and even the Jews were like, "Are you going to?" He saw, because Moses later saw 2 Jews fighting and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing? You're brothers." And they said, "What are you going to do? Kill me like you did that Egyptian?" And Moses is like, "Oh crap, I got to get out of here." He took off and went to the land of Midian and met his wife there eventually, and he was gone for 40 years. So he's pretty well along in years by the time God called him out of there, out of the land of Midian and back to Egypt to lead his people out. And he didn't even want to do it. And this, again, was not something the Jews would make up. And Moses, if you look into that story, also was like, I have a speech impediment. I can't talk to Pharaoh. And God is like, who made your mouth? Or, it's just like, okay, fine. Here's your brother Aaron. He's a good speaker. Take him with you. He'll do the speaking for you. God was pretty upset with Moses for this. But anyway, that's what was glossed over in this statement here, that this is how he wound up being the deliverer, that he was first chased out of Egypt, spent a long time away, and then came back. Okay. And that's the burning bush incident, which again, I point to as, that something that with the language in the Hebrew shows that the names of God aren't what the critics try to make them out to be. Because in that section, and I've gone over this in other videos, that this is, we have Moses saying, Elohim, what is your name? So Elohim was a generic word like we say God today. And he says, what is your name? He called him Elohim, but said, what is your name? So Elohim was not the name of God. God said, I am that I am, and this is reduced to an acronym. YHWH, as we use it in English, which we get Yahweh from, has nothing to do with Jehovah or Jupiter. It has to do, it's an acronym, and it means I am who I am. And he goes on to tell Moses, tell the people of Israel, I am has sent you, and I am the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if you look at just that passage of the burning bush, you would find out that all those little stupid theories have nothing to do with the name of God or who God is or where this name came from. And the 10 plagues of when Moses actually finally returned to free the Hebrew slaves, and that was not as easy done as said. There were the 10 plagues everybody knows about, and then eventually Pharaoh lets them go, and then he chases after him because he changed his mind because he was some special kind of stupid. And this is, a more familiar thing, so I won't go over that too much detail. And so you can read all about the 10 plagues if you need your memory refreshed or anything like that. And then we have the giving of the law, which is a significant thing in the Old Testament. So when they were at Mount Sinai, the Hebrews came there and God gave Moses the 10 Commandments at that spot. And then they got tired of waiting for Moses while God himself was etching things onto stone. And they turned to idolatry. And Moses broke the stones in anger, and then later God wrote them again. And that these tablets are the ones that were eventually placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, along with the rod or staff of Aaron that he was, his walking stick, and it sprouted leaves. And so that and the 10 Commandments and the jar of manna were put into the Ark of the Covenant. And then they were, you can read all about what happened as they were wandering through the desert. That's another kind of sub-period of this period 3 that they're calling it. Then we're going to get into the period of conquest. And I'll get to the chat in just a minute. It appears that we have what an ex-atheist once called rabid drooling atheist, the sort of people who go to evilbible.com and pick up little cherry-picked verses to try to make disparaging remarks about God in Christian hangouts, which I think is some kind of mental illness because, I don't go to like Hindu websites and mock them for believing in whatever Krishna or whatever they believe in. That's just an insane way to spend your life. But anybody who wants the truth can find it, but people who are just here to mock can just go someplace else. Anyway, the death of Moses in historical period 4, it begins with the death of Moses and the rise of Joshua as a successor. And this was the time when Moses gives his final speech because he knows he's about to die. And because of a misdeed earlier, he was not allowed to enter the promised land himself. And he gave them a choice. This is another thing about Calvinism, as this is where, in this general era, is where Joshua says, choose for yourself this day who you will follow. Will you follow God or not? And so this is what they call period number 4 of the conquest, where they go through and wipe out people that God said were evil. And this is speculation, but through a lot of other study, we can find out that this is not just God saying, you people, I just hate you and you're gone. He's just saying, you people have corrupted the genome, that these were the Nephilim and the, or not just the Nephilim, but their descendants. These were people who were committing bestiality and corrupting all flesh at this time in these lands. There was a lot of terrible evil going on, and it would affect and infect the whole world as it did before the flood. So God had to put a stop to that. And so this is one of the reasons that he cleared out that land and took it for himself, to keep mankind from going lapsing back so quickly into the time that brought about the flood. So this is the era of conquest, and that's why it was conquest. And that eventually they settled in the land of Canaan. Its original name was the land of Canaan, because that was the primary people group of that area, and that is the area on the east side of the Mediterranean. So this is, again, where I mentioned just a bit ago, choose this day who you will serve, okay? And then we get into the period of the judges. There were no kings in Israel at the time, and that they went through this cycle over and over of obedience and rebellion, obedience, rebellion, and that's what large portion of these this part of the Old Testament is about. And they give approximate dates here too, if you haven't been noticing, that this is all, you know, there's general timelines for these things, and we're up to about about 1100 BC here with the time of the judges and the prophet Samuel. Okay, and God sent prophets and judges, and these judges were in the place of kings, so to speak, but not formally anointed as kings, and they helped Israel at key points in their history to keep them from going too far astray. And one of those, and not all the judges were male. There were some female judges as well, such as Deborah and Huldah, and so we can't skip over, you know, that when we read those things. Pay attention to the names, and but basically I'm doing an overview, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And then we get into the David and Solomon period, the era of the kings. The first was Saul, but he turned against God, and so he was replaced by David, and Solomon was David's son. And and you can read more detail here. The list is in the description. And then the next period of the Old Testament is the divided kingdom. So there was a split. People rebelled against God for the last time, first in the southern kingdom, the 10 tribes, and then the other 2. And I've gone over the so-called lost tribes theory before and how that's debunked easily by the New Testament. So I won't go into that now. But there was a civil war, so to speak. And then they have this little side note here. And there's something going on in the chat I'll deal with in just a second, but let me look at this side note. And they say the subject of becoming Messiah, and this is the point about the Testaments, is woven into every part of the Old Testament, not the church, the Messiah. They're not exactly one and the same. One gave birth to the other, but the first, the Messiah, is what you will see all over the Old Testament, not the church. Okay? The Bible traces the blood lineage of the Messiah, beginning with Adam and Eve, and then all the way to Noah and his son Shem. And then the Bible reveals that the Messiah would come through the line of Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. Then from Jacob's 12 sons, then we have Judah as one of those, would be the one the Messiah would descend from. Finally, the lineage passes on to a man named Boaz, who had a grandson named Jesse, who lived in Bethlehem. One of his sons was David, and we just mentioned David here, who would be the promised seed and became king of Israel. The book of Matthew in the New Testament traces the entire lineage of the Messiah of King David all the way to Jesus Christ, the son of Joseph and Mary, the son, so it was called, of Joseph, as it says in the New Testament. He wasn't his actual father, but a stepfather, who was born in a manger, blah, blah, blah. So you have all these fulfillments. That's what the Old Testament is getting at. But along the way, it shows a whole bunch of details about how God narrows down the decision to choose how to save mankind and fulfill his promise in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 6, that the seed of the woman would crush the seed of the serpent. That's what the whole Old Testament is about, bringing mankind to the point of redemption. That's what the whole thing is for. And that's why they're taking us through this overview, and people were asking, well, what significance is the Old Testament? Why does it matter? It matters because it shows that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Redeemer, to undo what Satan and man did, everybody but God, that is, in the Garden of Eden. Okay. And then also in this section, they talk about the prophet Jeremiah and so forth. And then they go into period 8, which is the destruction of Israel and Judah. The first destruction, and that was in, they have the dates here, 722 to 586 BC. And they had more prophets. And then Israel fell. They were exiled. And then, in 2 pieces. They were exiled in 2 pieces. Then they returned from captivity. They had been in Babylon. And this is where we get into Daniel and the prophecies. And I've mentioned that a lot of times before. I won't go into that again about, and then there was a temple, the temple of Zerubbabel, which was the first, they call this second temple. And there's disagreement as to whether Herod's temple was a third temple or really a rejuvenation of the second, which I think most people hold to, that the temple of Herod could also be called the second temple, even though it was a rebuilt one and a refurbished one. But Herod was a supreme builder. He was very highly skilled at architecture and building. And so it was a pretty good structure. It still wasn't as good as Solomon's temple. And it's said that the elders of Israel wept when they saw Zerubbabel's temple because it was such a pathetic structure compared to the first one. Well, Herod kind of fixed it up a bit, not because he was a good guy, or he cared about the Jews, but because he was a builder. He loved to build things, and he was good at that. So then we have the close of the Old Testament. The people of Israel have all been taken to Babylon. They're in exile because of their disobedience. And then this is when they have some final prophecies. And Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, there was a promise. I think that's where we have at least one of the promises of one coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. That would be John the Baptist. But about 400 years passed between the Old and New Testaments. And that's where you get what is called the intertestamental period, where some significant things happen. One of those being the rise of the Talmud, which is an evil, vile document written by the Jews, the rabbis and so forth, that is against the laws of God. It's very misogynistic, very hateful and bitter. And people often mistake all these T words with Torah, Tanakh, and Talmud. They're very different things. The Tanakh is the Old Testament. The Torah is the law, but the Talmud is not from God at all. It's by the Jews, and it's against the Bible. And it's during this time that the Hebrew language fell into disuse. And then some people said, look, we got to preserve the word of God. And it was written in Greek. This was the time of Alexander the Great. And so they devised that they would get these 70 or 72, as some people would say, people together to write a Greek version of the Old Testament before the old one was gone. We're calling it the Old Testament. I explained why earlier. But this is why it's called the Septuagint. That means the 70, and it's abbreviated LXX in Roman numerals. But this is the Bible that was quoted by Jesus and the New Testament writers. That's why it doesn't match most English translations of the Old Testament, because they use the Masoretic text. And Masorete, the people who made the modern version of the Hebrew Old Testament that everybody uses, is just a new name for the Talmudists. So these people deliberately hid or obscured Messianic references so they could say that Jesus did not fulfill it. They made them vague enough and ambiguous enough that you couldn't easily do that. Whereas in Jesus' day, in the first century, Jesus and his followers all used the Septuagint to prove that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. Well, the Jews didn't like that, so they first tried making their own Greek version, but it didn't catch on, so they made their Masoretic text eventually, which, as I said, obscured the prophecies so they could say Jesus did not fulfill it. That's what the Jews were doing. And that's why we have a difference between the quotes of the New Testament of the Old and what we would go to read there if we went to those references and read them. They're not the same in many cases. They're very close, but the Messianic ones especially are different because the New Testament writers were quoting the Septuagint, not the as yet non-existent Masoretic text. That's why that's the case. So they had final prophets. Malachi told them to turn, chastise them for turning away from the Lord. Ezra and Nehemiah canonized the books of the Old Testament. It was they who did it. These Ezra and Nehemiah, the so-called minor prophets, are the ones who decided what the biblical canon was. And so this is where we once again debunk the part about the claim that the Jews or the Romans or somebody like that decided what was in the canon. They did not. It was Ezra and Nehemiah who decided what was in the Jewish canon, the Tanakh. And no, I have in the chat, I'm going to get rid of you in a minute. Just hold on. I'll deal with some of the things you've said, and then I'll get rid of you. But I did not miss hundreds of years. I said this is an intertestamental period of about 400 years that went on between Malachi and Matthew. Apparently, you missed quite a lot of words, as I've been saying, probably, I don't know, hundreds. Anyway, they read these things aloud. They found these things, the scriptures had been lost. I don't care who you were talking to, Max Shepard. I'm the channel owner. You better listen to me. Then we have this, they talk in this article more about the 400 years of silence where nobody was sent from God to Israel, and that's where a lot of these errors crept in. Then we have the New Testament. So I won't go over into that because I've already gone over the New Testament, but that is a brief overview of the Old Testament, which was the primary question I wanted to go over today, because I think it was Arwen that asked if we would talk about the Old Testament, and that is about the briefest overview you can have of the Old Testament. And next, after I take a little break here to deal with that problem child in the text, in the chat, so this is going to go more specifically about Messianic prophecies. Now let me roll up here. All the messengers are hidden now. That's okay. But if I recall, just looking briefly, I can reload some of those. First of all, about God killing people. Satanists especially, will say, well, Satan didn't kill anybody, but God killed millions. You know, he wiped out the whole world. Well, I beg to differ, because sin entered the world because of the temptation of Satan to against Adam, against Eve, really. Adam didn't need to be tempted. He just walked right into disobedience. But Satan is responsible for every death. Satan is responsible for mortality. Satan is responsible for our harm and suffering, because Satan instigated this fall of man. Man shares responsibility, absolutely, but Satan is responsible for untold billions and billions and billions of deaths. God did not cause death to enter the world, but death, since it's there, God will use to keep it from getting too bad too fast, okay? That's what that's about, and that claim of the Satanists is really quite ignorant and very poorly reasoned. They don't know the Bible anywhere near as well as they think they do. And no, I didn't call you a retard. I did not skip anything. My purpose here is not to go over every inch of the Old Testament. It's to give an overview. And apparently the atheist or the Satanist in the chat does not understand what an overview is. It is not a detailed study of every bit of it. I did that with the New Testament if you're interested in detailed studies. This is not that. This is not that day. This is an Old Testament overview. And the part about beating slaves is, again, a cultural, contextual issue that you people ignore, and that this is not a Christian issue. We're not ignoring anything, okay? And a beating is something some people only understand. Some people just don't get reason, and what can you do? That's what punishment is for, is to get through to people who don't listen to reason. And it's not the most evil thing in the world. One of the most evil things in the world to go around attacking people you don't agree with just because you can, from your anonymity behind the screen there, okay? And you are mocking. It's not criticism, it's mocking, all right? You're just denying everything you're doing and projecting, and then calling us projecting. And I've had enough of that kind of attitude. So if you try it again, you will be banned permanently. So just take your hatred of God and Christianity and your fear of Judgment Day someplace else, because this is not what this hangout is about. This is a Christian hangout. If you're not interested, move along. It's that simple. If you're grown up, that's what grown-ups do, okay? I don't know how old you are. I don't care. Your attitude is juvenile and mocking and trying to stir up trouble, and we don't need that here, and I won't have it, because this is a hangout, a haven for Christians, and I won't put up with that crap here, okay? So, gone with that kind of attitude. You're welcome to listen, but if you're going to make comments like that, just move along. All right, back to the topic at hand. This one is more specific. This article, again, is listed, the link is in the description, for specific Messianic prophecies. And all of them are what Jesus fulfilled, all the Messianic prophecies. So the crucifixion of Jesus was foretold in Psalm 22:16-18, approximately 1,000 years before Christ was born, long before this method of execution was even practiced. So you go to that psalm and read the description. It is not completely in every detail, but it says things about his method of death, which were unknown at the time. Nobody even invented crucifixions 1,000 years BC. Okay, and after his resurrection, preachers of the New Testament church began to declare officially that Jesus was Messiah by divine appointment. And there's some of the references to that. And nobody disputed these things. And that's why, again, why the Masoretic text was invented, because Christians were rightly dividing the word of truth. They were looking at the Septuagint and going, hey, look, the Messiah was supposed to do this, that, and the other, and Jesus did all those things. Things that he could not control, that his disciples could not control, such as his lineage, his place of birth, his being taken to Egypt and back again then to Nazareth, the bribing of the guards, the disciples were cowardly and hiding and poor. All of those things are things that he could not control. So, yeah, comment in the chat about he called me a snowflake, or called God a snowflake. Sorry, mistake. He called God a snowflake, which is mockery. So there you go. Anyway, I get more people in the chat. Glad you guys can come. But back to this after the atheist Satanist distraction. Anyway, the Old Testament, the unadulterated version, the non-Talmudic tainted version, I guess you could call it, clearly showed what the Messiah would do, and Jesus did all those things. And then they go into this statistical improbability, really impossibility, but we have to be precise in our terms, improbability, that Jesus could have fulfilled these things by treachery, or his disciples could have done any such thing. Lineage, methods of execution, the odds are given here, how astronomical they are, to use the term. And they go that they even reduce the number of prophecies to fulfilled, and it's still beyond chance. Okay, and here's a little chart that they give on just 44 of the prophecies. There are many more than that. And here's a quick list. The Messiah would be born of a woman only, not a male, not a father, a human father, that is. He would be born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, come from the line of Abraham, descendant of Isaac, descendant of Jacob, come from the tribe of Judah, heir to King David's throne. Messiah's throne would be anointed and eternal, would be called Emmanuel, would spend a time in Egypt. The children were massacred at his birthplace because Herod, in the blind rage, was trying to get rid of him. A messenger or angel, or that's the same word in Greek, but messenger in this case is human, which would be John the Baptist, would prepare the way for him. He would be rejected by his own people. He would be a prophet. He would be preceded by Elijah. Here again, the forerunner is John the Baptist. He would be declared the Son of God, would be called a Nazarene, bring light to Galilee, speak in parables, sent to heal the brokenhearted, be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He would be called a king, be praised by children, be betrayed. The price money would be used to buy a potter's field. There was an actual incident of this in the Old Testament about one of the prophets being sold field and told that the price was 30 pieces of silver, or he bought a field or sold one. I forget which way it went, but it was 30 pieces of silver. And that's what they offered Judas, the priests offered Judas to betray Jesus. Messiah would be falsely accused, silent before his accusers, spat upon and struck, hated without cause, crucified with criminals, given vinegar to drink, hands and feet would be pierced. And then again, we have both Old Testament and New Testament references for all of these. He would be mocked and ridiculed. Soldiers would gamble for his garments. None of his bones would be broken. He would be forsaken by God for a very short time. He would pray for his enemies. Soldiers would pierce his side. He would be buried with the rich, would resurrect from the dead, would ascend to heaven, seated at God's right hand, and be a sacrifice for sin. So that's a pretty good list of 44 things, and there's many more, of things that Jesus could not have forced into fulfillment. And there are some things that he did just because he had to fulfill things and he knew it, but things that were, humanly speaking, beyond his control. And so this is why the Old Testament proves that Jesus was the Messiah. And as I said, the Talmudists, then who called themselves the Masoretes in later times, obscured those things in Hebrew, in their language. And incidentally, of course, I did a video on language where I talked about Paleo Hebrew being a much different script than the modern square script, they call it, which is more Phoenician, is my understanding, if I've got my terms right. So this is, again, what the Old Testament is about. It's about the Messiah. It's not about the church. It's about the Messiah. And why did the Messiah need to come? To redeem mankind. Why did mankind need to be redeemed? Because Adam sinned, rebelled against God. And so that's what the Old Testament is about. And the New is the final chapter of that. Okay, and this is another page. I've got both these links in the description about how he fulfilled all these prophecies. And this is, a slightly different list with, some maybe a little bit of different emphasis, but there's a lot of overlap, if not all of it. I didn't go over everything in both lists, but these are, two different sources. And this is Jews for Jesus. This is not just, some random YouTuber here. Jews for Jesus. These are people who were Jews who became Christians. And of course, the Jews themselves hate people like this. They consider them traitors. But these people know their own scriptures and know their own history and know how to read, and much better than the critics do. And so I'm taking them as a credible source and not the critics. Now, just to kind of round things out a little bit, I had some articles back in 2007, so 10 years ago, where I wrote about problems with the Old Testament text and some issues with New Testament text families, and we're going to get into more of the Septuagint here. And first of all, this article I called Fan of Pharisees. You can see there that Jesus never had a kind word for the Pharisees. It was very harsh with them. They were the ultimate legalists. These are the people who are following the traditions of the Talmudists. Okay, this is why Jesus had such a problem with them. They were vile people and ultimate hypocrites, and their approach to Scripture was the same approach used by slick lawyers to squeeze every drop out of the law, ignoring the spirit of the law, meaning the purpose for which it was written and the intent behind it. So taking a law to mean anything and everything that could possibly extract it from it, they went sometimes to even tragically comic extremes. For example, if someone was sitting outside in their tent on the Sabbath and the chair broke, digging up a little dirt, they could be accused of plowing on the Sabbath. This practice is called putting a fence around the law in fear of violating it accidentally. In other words, it leads them to absurdity. So this is how bad the Pharisees were. They were as exemplified also in the fact that when Judas threw the 30 pieces of silver back at them when he realized what he had done, they, because of their legalism, said, we can't put this back into the treasury because it's blood money, and so they bought that potter's field with the 30 pieces of silver. This was just maddening, kind of bizarre hypocrisy that they would be so intent upon following the law at one point and so easily dismissing the law at other points. But that's just the kind of people they were. They were the ultimate hypocrites. So putting a fence around the law is an approach that makes a monster out of it. And people do this today, even some Christians. They put a fence around the law, don't drink, dance, gamble, etc. Or, you must obey the law, etc. So the Pharisees honed it to a fine art, not only out of the fear of accidental violation, that fence around the law, but also primarily out of greed and control. This is what the law is all about. And this is what Paul said in the New Testament about the legalizers, the Judaizers, people trying to put Gentiles under Jewish law. He said that these people were only wanting to brag and to control, and making the cross of no effect. So these Pharisees did exempting themselves from the law, just as people today who say you must obey the laws of Moses even though you're a Christian. They don't obey all the laws, and they pick and choose which laws to obey, which are binding and which are not. Something not even the Jews did, the regular Jews, the ones who actually tried to follow the law. But as at Acts 15, we saw that even James and Peter said this was a law neither we nor our ancestors could bear. So anyway, this does sound all too familiar to us today, where people enact laws that they themselves are exempt from, like our Congress, for example, as well. This is the sort of attitude that made Jesus' blood boil. But while the New Testament itself doesn't talk about what else the rabbi's been up to, it's more than a coincidence that he and the apostles always quoted the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the LXX or Septuagint. There are known problems with it, our earliest copies of it, and there are false ones. There are forgeries of it that are not, you got to be careful of. But how can we lightly dismiss the Bible Jesus quoted from? We can't. We have to look into the Septuagint. So the rabbis not only twisting the law that they had, but the scriptures themselves. These people who were willing to literally destroy the word of God, as Jesus represent and was, they would also destroy the written word of God. So the quoting of that, as I mentioned before, rather than the Hebrew scriptures, is the reason why the quotes don't always match. And this gets into Isaiah 7:14. Was it virgin or young woman who would give birth to a child? And this is one of those things they obscured. Okay, they used a more generic, wide-ranging meaning, Alma, I think it was, for a young woman, instead of when the New Testament writers quoted it, they used Parthenos, which is virgin, where you get the word Parthenon, the temple of the virgin. So that's why they used young woman. It was an obscuration, or whatever. I'm mangling that word, but they were obscuring the text. Mesorah, from what we get, Masoretes, was a tradition. So these are traditionalists. These are the people Jesus had a problem with, their traditions, the Talmudists. Okay, and they could do a lot with this vowel pointing, which I mentioned in my language video. So go back and watch that sometime. And Jesus said, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. And that's Mark 7:9. So even then, the rabbis were showing contempt for the word of God in favor of their traditions. And they would later attack the Septuagint for the same reason as I just mentioned a little bit ago. Okay, so the Masoretic text is the one that got copied and distributed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes, which is Talmudists, between the 7th and 10th centuries AD, whereas the Septuagint was done around 300 BC. Okay, so we have about a 1,000-year gap here, which is pretty significant. The Septuagint was translated from an earlier Hebrew text, not the Masoretic text, which is the basis for practically all translation of the Old Testament that we use today. The earlier Hebrew text is gone, but we do have other translations beside the Septuagint that also predate the Masoretic, giving us more insight into what the original likely contained. So we can go to these other languages, versions of the Old Testament that predate the first century, and of course the Masoretic text by a long shot, and help the Septuagint, get better light on the Septuagint. Okay, so no one can say with absolute certainty what the original Hebrew text was, but the likelihood of the Masoretic text being inaccurate and tampered with is certainly high enough to cause serious concern. At the very least, we should never have simply taken the rabbi's word for it when they were consulted for help when translating the scriptures. Their elevation of tradition over scripture to the point of denying their Messiah should raise serious reservations in our reliance on the Masoretic text. Okay, so there's other articles I've had here, and this is some quotes from another article we're going to look at next about a particular article about the Septuagint and attacks made on it. And these are some excerpts from that. We're going to look at the whole thing later. F.F. Bruce is a very well-known scholar, shows why the Jewish rabbis who rejected the Messianic evidence that Jesus was and is the Christ, they felt they also had to reject the Septuagint. And this is where we got this person named Aquila, did that monkey business with changing the prophecy about the virgin giving birth. Justin Martyr regarded the Septuagint as the only reliable text in the Old Testament. And this Justin Martyr is 160 AD, regarded the Septuagint as the real Old Testament. And F.F. Bruce says, where it differs from the Hebrew text as interpreted by the Jews have corrupted the text so as to obscure the scripture's plain prophetic testimony to Jesus as the Christ. So these are scholars saying this stuff. This is not just any random YouTuber making things up. Okay. Keep that in mind in the chat. If it rolls too much, remind me later when I get to it. I want to go through these documents before I go back to the chat. Anyway, there's clear evidence that the Hebrews tampered with these things. It's just not just an assumption. There's been research done by competent, reliable scholars. And this is where they're saying, where I'm getting these things that I've been saying, that the Masoretic text was deliberately done to hide Messianic prophecies. Then we have that this Justin Martyr was a Gentile born in Samaria near Jacob's well, lived approximately 110 to 165 AD. So just after the time of Christ, and just after the close of the New Testament canon. And he had this dialogue with Trypho, a learned Jew. He makes some remarkable statements which need to be analyzed as it pertains to the Septuagint and the alleged missing verses. We've heard that before from King James onlyist. Missing verses not found in the Jewish Masoretic text. Remember, the Jewish rabbis had by this time rejected the Septuagint from the synagogues and replaced it with their own new Greek translation of the Old Testament. This is that other Greek translation I mentioned that was just before the, during the time between the 1st century and about the 7th, or whenever they made the Masoretic text, okay, the Hebrew version. But they were twisting it all the same, even in Greek, before they did it in Hebrew. And they replaced the Septuagint with their own Greek version. But as Justin Martyr says in his dialogue, they had left off many of the scriptural verses which had previously been used to prove Jesus was the Christ. So not only did they obscure things, they took them out completely if they couldn't hide them. That's why you can't easily now go to a Hebrew Old Testament and find the Messiah there. So this is what's going on with tampering. But here again is the principle. Since we know there's tampering, then there's a way to find out about the tampering, and there's a way to find the truth. We at least know that what was tampered with and what wasn't, and it wasn't the entire Bible. Okay? We have ways of finding these things out and uncovering where the tampering happened. Okay, so as they go on here, this may seem shocking to those of us who have believed for years that the Masoretic text is the one and only true text of the scriptures, the Old Testament, and that the Jewish rabbis have preserved it flawlessly. I hear that all the time, even from people I used to really enjoy reading as apologists, such as Josh McDowell, who had written a very important book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict, where he puts the Bible under the same scrutiny that the unbelievers did, because he was an unbeliever when he did his research, just like that Simon Greenleaf I've mentioned before. And so everybody assumed, even Josh McDowell assumed, and this is Josh McDowell, by the way, was also one of these people who, when confronted with his own evidence that he didn't want to find the result of, that convinced him the Bible was true, he said he literally became physically ill when his cognitive dissonance got so bad he couldn't deny it, and he had to accept that there really was a God and the Bible was true, and it made him physically sick because of this. But he eventually became a great Christian apologist, not a perfect one, but a good one. And he's done a lot of important work for the kingdom. Anyway, he accepted the Masoretic text, which kind of floors me. As far as I know, unless he's changed his mind since then, I don't know. I haven't followed him all these years. But we should not think that these Jewish rabbis would have preserved the real text of God flawlessly. They preserved their own text flawlessly. Okay? Because people will say, look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're very much, they're 1,000 years older than anything we had before, and there's nothing missing. It's all very well preserved through all these copies. But that's only going so far back as the Masoretes. It doesn't go all the way back to the original Hebrew text. Okay? So then they said, because of all that, let's reconsider this question. Does it not make sense that any people who would crucify the very word of God, the Logos in the flesh, would also cut up the written word of God, which bears testimony to him? We have perfect testimony that this was done. We have the witnesses, not only of Justin Martyr, but the incredible evidence in the New Testament scriptures themselves, which in many places quote passages from the Old Testament which are not found in the Masoretic text. But in the vast majority of cases, they are found in the Septuagint, and in some cases in the Aramaic. There are Aramaic versions, but they do not predate the Greek of the New Testament. That's another different issue I won't get into right now. This proves that when it comes to the Son of God, who called himself the Son of Man, that the Jewish rabbis of the first 2 centuries were less than honest, less than candid, and they did violence not only to the Son of God himself, the Logos, but also to the written word of God when certain prophecies clearly pointed to the Christ as the Messiah. So, all the more reason to learn Greek. This was one of the motivations I had to at least learn enough Greek to look into these things myself and to, reference. I mean, I can sit down, I can tell you, as I have on the header of my, the background image on my channel, I can recite you the first 5 verses of John in Greek, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert in Greek. It just means I can read it, and my vocabulary is very lacking, but because I can read it, I can go to the reference material that's written in Greek and find stuff, and that's what I used when I did the New Testament. But anyway, it's a good reason to learn Greek, because even though it's very different, the Greek in the New Testament is very much later than and different from classical Greek and the Greek of the Septuagint. You can't just jump from one to the other. It's like jumping from modern English to early English, not Middle English, which is what the King James is written in, but early English, which is what something like Beowulf, however you pronounce that, one of the earliest major English literature was written. It's almost a foreign language. It's that different. The Greek is very different. So anyway, it's a good reason if you had any motivation, and I would like someday to have actual classes, because self-learning can only take you so far sometimes, and it would be easier to have lessons, but that costs money. So anyway, it would be nice to be able to read the whole Bible in Greek. And I knew there was someone online called Suzanne McCarthy, who had passed away since in the last few years, but she, as a child, learned to read Greek, and she would read the Greek classics for pleasure in Greek. She would read the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that in Greek. And it was easy for her. And she eventually showed up some of the patriarchal so-called people who took a few years of Greek in college and showed them what noobs they were, noob meaning newbie, wet behind the ears when it came to Greek, because she knew it inside and out. She knew it like a native, and they were absolutely twisting the Greek New Testament. And this is what these are twisting people, are the kind who are seen as Christian leaders and authors and interpreters. So we have to be very, very careful with these things. Anyway, the point is, the practice of deliberate mistranslation and ignorance of the problems of the Masoretic text continues today. The Bible has been made to support such evils as slavery and male supremacy by the churches because of these things. So we can't just point at the rabbis, but now also at many translation teams and individuals with an agenda of one kind or another. So there are attempts to bend the scriptures, to twist them, to omit certain things, and we've gone over some of that in the New Testament. And that new discoveries about the meanings of Greek words of the first century have not been put into the dictionaries for certain reasons, okay? Certain agendas. And this being, for example, where Eve turned to follow Adam. The word there in the Septuagint is apostrophe. That's where we get our word, apostrophe. It's from the Greek, and it means to turn away, turn back. That's what an apostrophe shape is. I'm doing this shape with my hand, which you can't see, of course, but you look at any apostrophe, and you'll see that it's a curve. It turns back toward itself. It turns away from something else, and that's what it means, and that's why it's called an apostrophe, a turning back. And that's what the word that in the Septuagint that Eve did when she turned to follow Adam instead of desiring. And they turn desire, that's what the rabbis do. They turn it into lust and turn it into the serpent seed theory, as the Kabbalists are wont to do. They like to make up these false things and then superimpose them back in time. That's an anachronistic fallacy, and make them, and this is the lie that people believe over the Bible. They believe that the Kabbalistic lies. So, anyway, we've gone over some of those New Testament things before, and now let me go on to my last tab here about the Septuagint. This is by William Dankenbring, and there was a particular instance where there was a debate in a certain denomination about the Septuagint, okay? And he begins by saying, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament come in for a great deal of criticism, one writer calling it a fraud, a forgery, and utterly corrupt. But is this true? When was the Septuagint translated, and for whom? What is the truth? Did Christ and the apostles quote from the Septuagint? Was it commonly used in Jewish synagogues throughout the Greek-speaking world? Why did they cease to use it? Was there a conspiracy to edit and amend the original Bible? The truth behind the story is a shocking, incredible bombshell, which will shake the world of Judaism, Christianity. There's much more to the story than we have ever known. That is a quote from William Dankenbring. And recent is, this is a fairly old document, so recent to his time, submitted to the Worldwide Church of God, which, anybody who studies these things knows that they had a lot of issues. This is just one tiny one among all their issues that they had with New Testament teachings, but, in violation of them. But the Worldwide Church of God, I believe, was started by Herbert W. Armstrong. And he did a lot of twisting. But anyway, I won't go into that right now. But they were trashing the Septuagint, okay? And they were distributing this critique, which William Dankenbring then goes on to tear apart and debunk. Okay, it was claimed by these other people, the Worldwide Church of God, that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament is totally corrupt and unreliable, and the only evidence that was ever made was a document called the Letter of Aristeas, and there's an assertion that he gives a citation for the number where this is found in the document trashing the Septuagint. There's no evidence that the Septuagint existed. Of course, this is quite ignorant, and Dankenbring will go on in his article to prove that this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but there's a link in the description, and you can go in. I encourage you to read through this, and he just goes bit by bit through every shred of this person's claim against the Septuagint that they used to turn their whole denomination away from it. And this is something that has an effect on our understanding of the Old Testament. So another thing that people don't know, that the Septuagint included the Apocrypha. Doesn't mean it included them as from God and inspired, but it included them as its collection of books. There's an important distinction there. The Apocrypha were never considered inspired scripture, but they were included in the Septuagint. And they're worth reading for historical purposes in most cases. But if you look up the word Apocrypha itself, it means of uncertain authorship or dubious authenticity. In other words, these are kind of iffy books, but they were included in the Septuagint, again, not as the Word of God, but as books worth reading as historical accounts, okay? They're not inspired by God, and they were never meant to be by the Septuagint translators. But they did translate these, or did include these books in their translation, okay? So that now you know a little bit more about what Apocrypha means. And they include the books of Maccabees, and the author that they're referring to in this article is the one critiquing the Septuagint, claims that even these books were supposed to have been translated by the 72 scholars sent to Egypt, along with the entire Septuagint. He asserts that no Hebrew high priest would have ever sent these books, and boasts that the fraud that is the Septuagint should be clear for all to see because of the inclusion of the Apocrypha. And the author goes on to accuse Origen of, this is another early church personages. I don't like to use the word church fathers. They're not the fathers of the church, only maybe of the Catholic Church, but that's a fake as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, he accuses Origen of having deliberately and knowingly taking the New Testament quotations from the Old Testament and inserting them into a Septuagint version, and found in something called the Hexapla. What is that? That is named for 6 side-by-side translations done column by column in ancient times. It was burned in the fire of the Library of Alexandria. But we have some snippets of it, so we know it existed. But it was called the Hexapla because it was of extremely valuable, a terrible loss, translation of of the Bible in 6 different languages. And so he was the one who Origen was the one who made this. And this critic is claiming that Origen made stuff up and that he didn't just translate. Okay, so there's all these charges and countercharges going on. This is nothing new to the Bible. The Bible is the most heavily critiqued writing of all time. And you got to ask yourself why. This is what happens to the truth and why it divides, because people don't like the truth, so they try to hide it, twist it, tear it apart, whatever. Anyway, Denkenbring goes on to show exactly how this critic was himself the fraudster, and that the Septuagint is being unfairly maligned. So, I again encourage you to look through this. It's a very long article, and he quotes Philo of Alexandria and other people in support of the Septuagint. And sorry if I'm giving you seasickness here running through this, but he also quotes S.F. Bruce. This is one of the, the quotes that I mentioned on my article on my blog about this, where I have a reference to this link in that, but I wanted to bring it out separately. And this is very thorough. As you can see, this is a very long critique. It's very well done. And then you get to the question of inspiration. I wanted to stop there and read through that a little bit. Since there were evidently several different texts in existence during the time of Christ, I don't know why that's rolling. I'm not moving my mouse. Did they pinpoint and select a particular text as being the only truly divine inspired one? We have no proof of that. In fact, just the opposite. The evidence is that they quoted from several different texts, and sometimes even from textual material found in ancient Jewish commentaries called the Targums. There's another T word that is not the Talmud, such as the Onkelos Targum, says F.F. Bruce, and then he quotes about which was considered canonical or not, or least authoritative by the Lord and his apostles, or by the New Testament writers in general, no one form. One might expect that the writers in Greek would use an accessible Greek version of the ancient scriptures, and that is to say the Septuagint. The New Testament writers did this to a very considerable extent, Luke and the writer to the Hebrews in their biblical citations and allusions adhere quite closely to the Septuagint wording, but other New Testament writers exercise greater freedom. In Matthew 12:18-21, there's a quotation from Isaiah 42:1-4 in a Greek form which is markedly different from the Septuagint even, okay? So a New Testament writer may quote the Old Testament in a form closer to the Hebrew construction. He may even quote it in a form parallel neither to the Septuagint nor in the traditional Hebrew text, but in an Aramaic paraphrase or targum. It looks at times as if the New Testament writers enjoyed liberty to select a form of New Testament text which promoted their immediate purpose in quoting it. Certainly, they did not regard any one form of text as sacrosanct. In other words, absolutely, you must quote this one. In other words, the whole collection of documents together is what constituted the Bible in their minds. Okay? But they especially relied on the Septuagint. And he goes on to say, in this, they have provided a helpful precedent for us when we're told, especially on theological, not critical grounds, that one form of the New Testament text is uniquely authoritative. And that's not just a King James only issue. It's a Greek text family issue. And that is getting, the New Testament, of course, but we also have the Old Testament to think about. And the Septuagint should not be brushed aside, as that critic was doing in the article by William Dankenbrink. So what they're saying here in this quote by F.F. Bruce is that the New Testament writers did not adhere slavishly to any one translation of the Old Testament. They took them all into consideration, but held most closely to the Septuagint. So I'm not saying that either. And when it comes to the New Testament or any Bible, I always tell people, even if you don't look at the original languages, get a different English translation or whatever language you have, get it from a bunch of different perspectives, because everybody has a blind spot, everybody has an agenda, everybody has a benefactor or committee telling them how to do things, to promote a certain twist or angle or leaning. As, for example, the King James's big concern was putting down the Calvinists who were dissing the king and his divine rights. And so he made sure that the King James emphasized what is called the divine right of kings. And so that has a prejudice as well. And so if you want to get past that, you have to get a whole collection of Bibles, not just different styles of translation, which are all legitimate, by the way. And by the way, a translation is a translation no matter how good or well it's done, because it's between one language and another. A paraphrase is within a language, like Old English to New English. That's a paraphrase. It's not a translation. So anyway, the point being that you can get closer to the truth by carefully choosing different Bibles in your language from different denominations and different committees with different purposes and biases. Okay, and that even then, though, there is one universal bias that has beyond race bias, beyond denominational bias, beyond even the Catholic Protestant bias. You have the sex bias, the bias against women. This is universal. We've seen it even among Protestants, even the most modern language-free translations, such as the New Living Bible, extremely patriarchal, extremely bad translation choices when it comes to women. And so there are times when even the multitude of translations can't help you, and that's why I know the Greek as well as I do, just because of that issue. It's like, you're not going to hide this from me. I will find out what the Greek says. And I'm not the only person who's done that. Like I mentioned, Susan McCarthy was an absolute expert on the Greek, and there was another one that I relied heavily on her research notes, was someone who's still living today, Anne Nyland, who is a scholar of both classical and Koine Greek, which is the common Greek of the New Testament era, the first century. And these are people you got to take seriously that are routinely excluded by the Christian powers that be, because they don't want to hear the truth about the Greek. They don't want to hear the truth about different versions, because they get in the way of their agendas and biases. And so you have to do your homework. And that's really, I think, the big lesson here as far as translations go. As it says, this is still the Dankenbrink article, as he says, clearly God has preserved his word, but he has used many texts and versions to accomplish this task. And he has allowed, if not inspired, many different translations of his word into the English language and other languages, of course. We cannot say that any one translation is perfect, for none are. Based on the evidence available to us, however, the best overall English translation of the Bible, in his opinion, is the King James. I disagree with him at this point, okay? They like it, but even this person who prefers the King James will say it's not perfect. That's my point here in emphasizing his words at this point. He believes the King James is the best in English, but he's not like the King James onlyists who say it's the only, everything else is false, and those poor people who didn't have a King James version until 1611, too bad for them. You know, that's pretty much what King James onlyists leads to. But this person who prefers it and thinks it's the best one, I disagree with him about that, but even he will say it's not perfect. It's just his preference. You can learn something from modern translations. The spate of archaeology and research of scholarly continually adds to our knowledge of both the scriptures and the meaning of ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic words, and the ancient society in which the scriptures were written. We learn more about the context when we do those things. Okay, not sure why that message fell for you. I'll just click on that real quick. So this gives us context as well when we study the secular writings. This is why for a long time people thought that the New Testament was written in a special Holy Ghost language. They didn't know enough, they didn't have enough secular documents to tell them that this was just the language of business and commerce. This was the language that really was syncretized or synthesized by Alexander the Great in an effort to unify his kingdom, because there were many Greek dialects. And so he tried to homogenize them, I guess is an understandable word, into one common Greek. And that's what common Greek was, Koine Greek was, and that's the language of the New Testament. Okay? So, therefore, he concludes, Bingham Ring concludes from quoting Peter, all flesh is as grass, the glory of man fades as a flower of grass, but the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is a word by which the gospel is preached to you. So God's word will be preserved, but we can't think that he only preserved it in one particular instance. We take it all into consideration and compare them. And so the good news is that God preserves what he wants preserved, and we can't rely on one text for this. This is just immature, in my opinion. So I'm going to put all those down, and let me take a look at the chat. Let me roll back here. Let me go up pretty far. Let's see. Calendar, Nicoderma, you mean Nicodemus. Let's see. Yeah, we had some distractions. Snowflake is a mockery. Let's see. That's where I left off. Let's see. Yeah, Nicodemus actually became a believer, as was Joseph of Arimathea. They were both Pharisees, but they are the two who took Jesus' body off the cross and buried it. So yeah, they were followers. All the original Christians were Jews, of course. But anyway, skeptical of the Masoretic text. Yeah, an interesting name, Zadok. The Zadok priesthood is the name given in Ezekiel's chapter 40 and later about the millennial temple, a priesthood of Zadok. Anyway, let's see. Yeah, looking through the text here. Put Matthew 5:18, Matthew 5. One and the same. Yes, that's the phrase is one and the same. Let's see. How do we know that the Saturday Sabbaths, many Messianic scholars, are the same Sabbaths kept by Messiah? All I can say, because other people have asked that question before, is that Jesus had to be an observant Jew to fulfill everything. Okay, so, and we've had a pretty good idea of days of the week. It's the years we have problems with. You know, what year we call it is a different issue. But days of the week and seasons have been pretty well trackable back that far. So and we can even go pretty far back, even before BC, as far as seasons go. Years, as I said, are a little bit more iffy. And that when it comes to days of the week, people in all cultures pretty much, I don't know if there are exceptions or how many, have been keeping track of 7-day weeks for whatever reason. But we can rest assured that Jesus was observing the proper Sabbath. That's all I can tell you. And the thing is that we're not Jews, and the Sabbath doesn't matter to us anymore. As Paul said in Romans 14, even some consider every one day more special than another. Others consider every day alike, and each one should follow their personal convictions. And in another passage in the New Testament, Paul says that I fear for you because you've been observing days and weeks and years and Sabbaths and new moons. So he's making it clear that he's talking about his problem with people still observing Jewish law, not just any law or not just pagan calendars. He's talking about the Jewish law. So Paul is a pretty good authority and about whether or not Christians observe the Sabbath, and that is a Jewish observation and a Jewish law. And there are no violations for breaking the Sabbath that are listed anywhere in the New Testament. So it's not really a big issue to me whether observing the proper Sabbath, but it is to people who still want to follow Jewish law. That would be a better question for them. Let's see. As far as Sunday goes, just to follow up on that, the only reason Christians got into observing Sunday as a special day is because that's the day of the week that Jesus rose from the dead. It was the first day of the week. They didn't call it Sunday. That's a pagan name. All the names of our week in English are pagan names. They're named after gods, so-called. We have the sun, the moon. We have Odin on Wednesday, Odin's day, Thor's day. And Saturn, of course. But the Hebrews, even the Christians originally called it the first day of the week, the second day of the week, and so on. And they even called, the Sabbath was called so because it was a day of peace and rest, not because it was the seventh. That wasn't their word for seven. Pentecost had more to do with that. But as far as, names of anything, but that was a name of weeks and not a name of days. Anyhow, I would prefer we called it 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 day, 6 day, 7 day. It's easy to say and it makes a lot of sense, but those are the names, the names of months. Also, a lot of them are like Janus, the god, the two-faced god that looked backward and forward was looking back at the old year and forward to the new. That's a Roman god name. I think it's Roman. And the Hebrews didn't call it that. Even some of our names are Latinized names for numbers, such as October, from the word we get octal, or 8. November was 9, and December was 10. December was originally the 10th month, not the 12th. And so January and February would have been months 11 and 12, and March would have been the first of the year, as it was in the ancient times. That was spring. And so March was the first month of the year. But we have a mixture of pagan names and number names in our month names. So anyway, just a little trivia. There were also actually in the Old Testament a 360, not 64 day year was considered by many a prophetic year, who had 360 days, and this may reference to times before the flood. I've read Enoch. I read all three of them. There's a version translation mentioned that I mentioned the author of Ann Nyland that did the Source New Testament. I don't recommend because of the source itself, because it's touted as she is a person who unfortunately promotes the gay agenda, and this is a very, I wish she hadn't done that, but this doesn't mean she's a bad translator of Greek. She is an expert on Greek. But I don't promote her version very much because of her interpretation issues with excusing homosexuality, which I am totally against. People tend to lump egalitarianism with that, and this is not accurate at all. But she also translated Enoch, all three of them. And even from her translation, which I trust for its accuracy, second and third Enoch are clearly not inspired. They're more fanciful. First Enoch is an interesting read, at least, but even that is a stretch sometimes, and I don't consider it inspired scripture. It's as interesting to read as anything else would be of the time, but I don't hold to it as biblically significant. Even though Enoch himself is mentioned in the New Testament, there is no book of Enoch mentioned in the New Testament, and we have concerns about authenticity of the book of Enoch, even the earliest ones. So it's, it's there for what it's worth. Take it with a grain of salt, but it is an interesting book nonetheless. And Enoch himself was mentioned, but as the seventh from Adam, which makes him a pretty good authority. But whether the book of Enoch is from him is another question, because we don't have any copies from his time, from way before the flood, and that's the problem. Let's see, look more things through the chat. Thank you for any kind comments. I really appreciate those, especially today, since we had a very boisterous critic earlier. Let's see, the Catholic boys singing about Lucifer. We have to be careful. Lucifer is a Latin word meaning a light bearer, and so we have to be careful what they mean by it. And you will find they rely heavily on Latin and the Jerome's Vulgate translation, which Vulgate means in the vulgar tongue, the common tongue, but he didn't do especially the best job of it. And the Catholics rely on it heavily. It suits their purposes at times. And even the King James had to revert to that sometimes because they had nothing else to go on. And they said so in their preface. And they expected it to be corrected and things to be updated, because they even knew the English language changed a lot. And so they did not expect anyone to slavishly follow their translation, the King James. But anyway, the word Lucifer, you have to understand whether they mean the evil entity that came to adapt that name that people gave to him, or whether they mean light bearer in Latin. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. So anyway, it's not that Lucifer means day star. It's just that that's the Latin word that they use to translate the Hebrew and or Greek. And he is the false light. So light is an accurate word, but you have to say whether this is the true light or the false light, because as the New Testament tells us, Satan masquerades as an angel of light, and so it should be no surprise when his ministers or servants go around pretending to be the light. And so there is true light and false light, and so we have to ask that question for clarification. But yeah, the Luciferians think he's the good guy. This is what Gnosticism is all about as well. Kabbalism, they're all Luciferian in my opinion, because they all have the same basic teachings, that Lucifer was good to tempt Adam to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, tempted Eve, I'm sorry, and Adam just did it or not blindly, the opposite of blindly, with his eyes open. He did it willingly and knowingly, whereas Eve had to be fooled. And the Greek word and the Hebrew word both mean something more than simply convincing her, that she was mesmerized, basically, that he pulled a really bad deception on her, and which is why God did not lay the blame for sin at her feet, even though she was the first to eat the apple or fruit, whatever. It didn't say apple. We just, too much tradition there. But anyway, not to go into that again, the point is that the Luciferians and all that stem from that take Lucifer to be the good guy because God was hiding true knowledge from them, which of course is the opposite of the truth, which is what Lucifer does as the false light. Let's see. Yeah, that's basically, I didn't roll down to what Teal said there. She pretty much saying the same thing there. Okay, let's see. Learning Greek. Yes, I know some very nice people who are Catholics, and I don't mean to make this personal, but I've also gone on to into this in my videos about Babylon. The roots of the Roman Catholic system are essentially the Babylonian religion, which is why they wear fish hats. It has to do with Dagon, which was the god of the Ninevites, interestingly enough. But they are putting a Christian veneer on the Babylonian religion. And this is why Rome has never really died, but it will resurrect in the last days and be the head of the Roman system, will be, in my opinion, the false prophet of Revelation and the woman that rides the beast. And we are, in the Western world, is the beast. I don't believe the Western world is Babylon. But there are overlaps and parallels, to be sure. These are both beasts. They're called the first beast and the second beast, as well as the beast and the false prophet in Revelation, but beast nonetheless. So anyway, looking at the chat some more, and more about Catholicism. Yeah, they can play fast and loose with this dual meaning of Lucifer as light bearer. They have to ask, which light are you talking about, the true one or the false one? So thanks also for plugging my websites. That's very nice of you. Let's see. More slippers, dirty socks. We got it all here today. Let's see. New Testament, Old Testament. Yeah, read them carefully. Read them for context is all I can say. And there is, unfortunately, a big overlap between King James onlyists and sexism. And this is also true of most of the New Testament translations. There are very few, if hardly any, that are fair and honest when it comes to the women passages. This is also seems to be heavily Calvinistic as well as King James onlyist. Let's see. Yep, use the internet to your advantage. Yeah, I've been called all sorts of names too for various things. I had some run-ins with one of the chief proponents of King James onlyist, who calls himself, he has his real name is Neville. I think his last name is Chamberlain. He was a known fraudster in the UK, defrauding old people out of their money, thinking he was going to buy an island for them to go to when the tribulation started. And I don't know if he went to jail for that or not, but he goes by another name. Dusty Peterson, I think, is his pen name, that he is widely quoted by King James onlyists. And this guy is nasty. I've met him, online myself. So King James, was he an occultist, a Knights Templar? That I don't know, but he was not a good guy. If you look at fair historical records, which sometimes are hard to find online, he had a lot of issues. He is, people would say you're just trying to dig up dirt on him, but there is some evidence that he was homosexual, that he was the kind of person who would be, flaunt his power as king. But when he was caught, he was surrounded by some people. They were walking somewhere, and people came upon them with swords, and he allegedly soiled his riches, as the tale goes. He was just a bizarre person. But, what do we expect of kings? But King James was not a good guy, and he only commissioned the translation of the Bible because of jealousy of the reformers, and especially the Geneva Bible, which had footnotes in it that the Calvinists were using to be against kingly authority, and he had to put a stop to that, and that's why he commissioned that version. And it was mostly overseen by a guy named Richard Bancroft, who made edits of his own after the final version was presented by the translators, who weren't bad people for the most part. They were doing the best they could and said so in their preface, but Bancroft made a few little changes of his own before he presented it to King James. And incidentally, that handwritten first copy was lost. And we have the printed copies, which include typos and the omission of not in one of the 10 Commandments into thou shalt commit adultery, the so-called wicked Bible. The King James onlyists don't want you to know about those things, but look into it, do your research. So anyway, yeah, there is a poetry about it. It was a nicely done translation for its time, and that's the key word there, for its time. There are no omissions in the newer versions. Rather, the King James had additions to it, which is what we got into a little bit with that part I quoted from William Dankenbring about the Septuagint, and how the rabbis took out things to make their translation of the Old Testament. And but this has been researched that the oldest text of the New Testament do not include certain passages and verses, which even if you take those out, do not impinge upon the gospel whatsoever. The new versions did not take out anything. The King James added them. And this is a studied opinion. This is not just my opinion. They don't omit things. They don't try to take anything out. They're trying to be accurate to the earliest versions of the Greek and Hebrew text that they have. That's all it is. So this is a problem with the King James, and they made a lot of mistakes, and they knew it. If you read the preface, couldn't think of the word for some reason, read the 1611 preface, the to the readers part, and see what they said. It's a real eye-opener. So let me, the chat skipped on me again as I'm trying to roll slowly through it. So let me go back to where I was. Yeah, so the new translations, if you got that from King James onlyism, they are very selective in their citation of scholars, and Dusty Peterson is one of the major ones. And I had an argument with him and got banned from his message board because of it. It wasn't his board; he was a moderator, and I was banned by what I call the Red Queen, off with her head, without hesitation, just for questioning this guy. I wasn't mean and nasty at all. So, but he's a source of a lot of, Gail Ripplinger was a piece of work who is responsible for the modern King James only movement, in my opinion. And she got her stuff from other people. She plagiarized things. She deliberately twisted her quotations of new versions. She deliberately left out parts of the King James version that put it in a bad light as far as obscuring the gospel goes. Do your own research again. I mean, don't just listen to people who critique the modern versions and call themselves Bible believers. This is keywords that King James onlyists use. But anyway, yes, Christ is our Sabbath. Looking through the chat again. As I said, look at Romans 14 as far as days of worship go. There is nothing specified for the church, for Christians. The actual day he rose, this is easier to pinpoint because I believe he was crucified on a Wednesday afternoon, as I've gone over in my other Hangouts and documents. And I believe he rose around between 3 and 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, or Sunday, the first day of the week. That's what the New Testament says, the first day of the week. Regardless of the word Sabbath, it was the first day of the week. And that's pretty well traceable back to the first century. So I'm not too worried about that. But even again, it was just a tradition that the church did. Paul himself said it doesn't matter. Every day is alike to some people. Some other people say one day is special, and everybody has to follow their convictions. Don't worry about the calendar. It's not an issue for the church at all. It's not an issue for Christians. So, yeah, I didn't expect to go this long either, but things come up. I mean, I've covered the whole Old Testament. I don't expect to go over it again because it's been done by so many people, but I at least gave you some links you can use. And yeah, I'm getting kind of hungry. I haven't eaten much the last couple days because I had a stomach ache. I'm feeling better today. Drank my silver last night, and I think that helped. But I am going to shut down here. I just want to make sure I cover the chat. Let's see. Yeah, people equate homosexuality and egalitarian. It's just guilt by association because there is some people who hold to both, like Ann Nyland, but it is not fair to lump us all in that because we don't. I mean, the Bible clearly teaches against it. It teaches against any sexual activity outside of one man and one woman for life. And that divorce is permissible if somebody's either divorced you in every other way, but that they've cheated on you, or they've been beating you, or they have distanced themselves from you or neglected you, whatever it is, that's a divorce that's already happened. And we shouldn't let laws of the land make people forced together. That's what Paul taught in his writings. I think is in 1 Corinthians was the major one, where he talks about if the unbeliever wants to go, let them do so. God has called us to live in peace. And so it isn't the hard and fast, heartless rule that people make it by just quoting what Jesus said out of context. And I've gone over that before. But anyway, it still is an action and a choice. I mean, there are people who I like to compare it to alcoholism, for example. There are people who they can actually trace, unlike homosexuality, they can trace genetic markers that predispose a person to alcohol addiction. But we never make excuses for alcoholics in spite of that. We just say, stay away from alcohol. It's a problem for you. You have to stay away from it. And that if we're around somebody who is an alcoholic, it isn't good to wave alcohol in their face. You have to be considerate. But at the same time, they can't say that no one should drink alcohol just because they can. The Bible does not teach total abstinence, but it does teach don't be drunk, don't lose control, be filled with the Spirit instead. And it's the same thing with why do we make excuses for homosexuality, which does not have a genetic marker? They've tried to say there is one, but none have been found. Whether you, for whatever reason, childhood trauma, whatever it is that makes a person lean that way, we should tell them the same thing we tell alcoholics. Just don't act on it. You have to stay away from that world. You have to, if you have to be celibate, I'm sorry, but even a lot of heteros have to be celibate. People who never found a mate, they have to be celibate if they're Christians. So it isn't just a problem for homosexuals. There are heterosexuals who have to be celibate as well. They can't have just anybody they want. You know, they can't have another married person. Nobody can have children. Pedophilia, even though it isn't marked by that word, is such an abomination. I mean, you know, define child, people go all into that. The Bible says, so, you know, maybe Mary was a teenager and such and such. But here again, we're talking about whether a person, and there are cultural considerations. I'm not making excuses for it now because clearly children are not prepared for that. And I'm not making excuses for it, something the Bible didn't talk about, okay? The Bible didn't say it, but it also didn't say, don't, point blank in the New Testament, Jesus never said don't commit bestiality. And we all know that's wrong and something he would never condone because the Bible says here's where it's legal, man and woman. So don't go screwing around with messengers, don't do it with animals, and don't do it with children. It's one man and one woman. These are talking about adults. And so we can say this is what God allows it. It's very easier to say when you are allowed to have sexual relations than when you're not. And it's anything outside of one man and one woman. That's how the Bible defines marriage. I mean, it says it in both testaments. Jesus affirmed Moses' statement in Genesis that a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife and they become one flesh. This is what the Bible defines as marriage. And so, and marriage is permitted sexual union. And so anything that is not that is not permitted. And so we can rule that all out. So homosexuality, like any form of promiscuity, even by heterosexuals, is a sin against God. And that, especially even in Romans 1, Paul says that in condemning what people do who turn against God, he's saying God gave them over where men inflamed one's lust for other men and women for other women. And so they brought upon themselves the judgment due them. You can't put it in any clearer terms. And this is New Testament, where Paul is writing in chapter 1 of Romans that this is what he describes homosexuality. He doesn't use the word homosexual. That's, you know, just, you can't go by that. You have to go by the description. And he says men lying with men, women lying with women. This is what's wrong. And so as an egalitarian, then what does that have to do with women being equal in being and equal in function, equal in role? It has zero to do with it. It's just that the biological distinction that we have, that people come in so they can reproduce in the proper sphere. And this is not a condoning of homosexuality. Anyway, I probably went too far with that, but yeah, that's, I think, you know, I just caught up with your comment there, Teal, that that's what this is. I'm sorry, I have to mute for just a second. I'm not quite done. Let me answer the phone. All right, I'm back. I just found out that we have my son's car had some things, little things going wrong with it, and we took it to the shop, and it's going to be almost $2,000, and I don't know where. We have to have it done. It's a safety issue. Brakes, rotors, the battery shot, stuff came loose, an axle problem. I'm like, oh my goodness, because we had some flooding recently, and he didn't see a big pothole and went into it and bumped bottom, and it just did. And there were other things that were wrong before, but oh man, $2,000. Anyway, so at least I'm almost done here. I just want to catch up with the chat. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think we're Babylon either. Like I said, I think we're the kingdom of the beast, and Babylon, prophecies and descriptions have to be very precise, and there's things that don't fit. So yeah, back to that again. Let's see. Okay, all this thing jumped again when I'm trying to scroll through the chat. Missed a few people, sorry about that. Rolling back in the chat again. I hate it when it jumps on me. I get, within 10 feet of the end, it jumps to the end. Oh, I hate that. Okay, I think I'm back where I was. Catholic history, witchcraft. Yep, no doubt about that in the royal houses. Let's see. Okay, first day of the week. Yeah, the stomach ache. I don't know whether, sometimes I can eat onions and it doesn't cause me a problem, but I think it might have been a coincidence again that it was, maybe the onions have something in them that sometimes it's beyond a certain level and I can't digest it or what, but I'm feeling pretty good now. Let's see. Let's see, Old World Order. And it's not about monogamy only. I mean, like I said, Romans 1 describes men with men, women with women as being wrong as well, because you just, that's not what God designed, and God said don't do that, and so you don't do it. That's just all there is to it for Christians. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of practicality in certain things, such as the fact that women couldn't really go to war because of bearing children, and raising children took a lot longer because you couldn't just, and they had extended families, and we can't just say they couldn't just, have childcare. They did have childcare. They had extended families. They had friends and neighbors that would look after each other's children. And there were businesswomen. I mean, the woman of Proverbs 31 is praised for her dealings with foreigners, doing business with them. And so it's not completely as we think it might have been. But in practical terms, yeah, it was, women just weren't as big and strong, and you had to be more physical in those days. Now, it's just like with defending the home. A woman can pick up a gun just as well as a man, and there are women sharpshooters, and have been for a long time. So when it comes to force, even most men would choose a gun or a knife over just physical strength. Even in those days, they had knives and arrows and things like that, but it was more directly physical. But now, when it comes to home defense, a lot of times, I mean, the gun is the equalizer. It's a defensive weapon that makes, physical strength obsolete in some respects. So, anyway, let's look through the chat a little bit more. Yeah, there was a lot brought on in the Adam and Eve thing that God did not directly say that all men would rule over all women. He never said that. And it isn't true in history. I mean, it's been the majority, but look at the Amazons. That's more than a myth, I think. And that's why I did that one video on Timothy called Timothy Meets Wonder Woman. It has to do with the Amazonian myths and the fact that they did rule their society. So, and they were strong warriors. It may have been they had Nephilim genes, who knows, but they were certainly to be reckoned with, and they defeated male armies at times, and the Greeks had to deal with them. So anyway, so yep, Annie Oakley was a more modern day sharpshooter, and that's where they get the phrase Annie, get your guns. But I need to shut down. I got to go figure out how I'm coming up with $2,000 all of a sudden. We have a very small cushion in our budget for those sorts of things, and that's all all the money we have to put toward medical, and there's bills like that we can't even pay right now. But it's like, oh man, you have to put the bills first that will impact your credit rating. And we all know that when it comes to medical insurance, the insurance company pays the medical personnel. It's just whether the insurance company gets paid back, and they're getting a lot higher premiums than they used to get. And the whole Obamacare mess, it's like we're getting robbed from left, right, front, back, and center. That's just unbelievable. But I got to find a way to pay that car bill. So anyway, some people say that about the Amazonian women. It's not sure. Some of the stuff I did look into when I did that video, it's possible some of them did that, but it's not a hard and fast established historical fact as far as I know, but it's possible they might have done that. Anyway, I'm going to shut down and deal with things and get a drink, get my tea, and get some food, and see how that goes. But you all have a great day. I don't know if I'll do a hangout tomorrow. A lot of times I didn't do one on Fridays anyhow. I probably won't. But yeah, I think the chat's getting a little crazy anyhow. So I'm going to shut down. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you all next time.